Rhythm Infinity 1.2.3 meter in measures. I'm going to jump right in to this first slide. So we've been studying the quarter note, studying it as one count. So what we're going to do is imagine that that quarter note is a single block of wood or block of anything that's a 1/4 inch in length. And we're considering that quarter note one full count like we have been the whole time in the previous lessons. So we count that as one and. And if you look to the right, we're imagining that there's a 1 inch space or a 1 inch frame, if you will, from 0 to 1. And within that 1 inch frame, we have 4 slots or 4 spaces within that frame that are a 1/4 inch in length. So we have the first space that's a 1/4 inch, the second space that's a 1/4 inch long, a 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch, etc. So what that 1 inch frame represents is what's going to be called a measure you're going to see, so you don't have to really know that right now. And within this 1 inch frame, we have 4 and no more, a maximum of 4 and not any less than 4, but exactly 4 spaces to work with, which we're calling 4 slots. And we're going to equate those slots with being counts within the measure or within that 1 inch of space. It may seem confusing now, but as we go, it'll make more sense. Okay, so we have those 4 1/4 inch blocks that are within each one of those 4 spaces within the measure. And if you look to the right, you'll see a 4 on top of a 4. That's called 4/4 time, or what we call a meter of 4/4, 4/4 meter. The top 4 means that there's only 4 slots allowed within that 1 inch space, or what we're going to say is that it's going to be 4 counts allowed within the measure. So in other words, it's no more than 4 and it's no less than 4. It's exactly 4 slots allowed within that 1 inch space, and that's it. The bottom 4 is that we're considering each one of those 1/4 inch blocks as one block, which is going to be 1 count. In other words, we're going to be calling the quarter note 1 count. So just like we call a single 1/4 inch block 1 block, we can call the quarter note as 1 count. And again, this is going to make much more sense when we play and read. But bear with me here. So the 4/4 meter, look at the bottom one of the 4/4. Only 4 counts are allowed in a measure. Not 3 counts, not 5 counts, but exactly 4 counts, no more and no less. And then the bottom 4, that means quarter note is counted as 1 single count. So if you look to the left, you'll see that 4 on top of the 4, and you see 4 quarter notes. And you see these vertical lines that have arrows to them. Those are called measure lines or bar lines. They both have 2 names. So we have 4 quarter notes or 4 counts within the measure lines. In other words, we have 4 counts per measure right in there with the 4 quarter notes there. And if you look to the bottom, I basically have a composite tablature diagram, the 6 horizontal lines representing the guitar strings, and then the 2 vertical lines are now going to be considered as measure lines. So whenever we count and we have measures, count 1 is always next to the left bar line, and then the last note value, in this case count 4, or any part of count 4, it's the last note next to the right bar line. And we'll move to the next slide and explain some more. All right, so we have a tablature example. We're going to be playing string 5 open, or fret 0 on string 5 as quarter notes. As we've learned previously, the stem attached to a tablature fret number only means that those are played and counted as quarter notes. Okay, so we have our 4/4 there, 4 counts per measure. In other words, 4 counts up to that rightmost bar line. And the bottom 4 meaning we're counting each quarter note as a single count, 1 and then the next quarter note, 2 and, so on and so forth. Now, if you see that arrow, that dotted arrow going from the and of 4 pointing to that bar line, that means count 4 is over with, or any part of count 4 is over with. And then you see the arrow on the right-hand side pointing to count 1, That means on the other side, that's where count 1 starts over again. So you can say that we have 2 measures here of 4/4. That's basically musical terminology. And we're playing that string 5 note open, which we will do in this example right here, and count. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So what we did there was play 2 measures of 4/4. If you look at the bottom, I just restated what we did above minus the string number that we're using. Basically, that's just 4 quarter notes in general. It's a standard notation example. In standard notation, those would be on lines, and they would represent notes like A, B flat, whatever. But again, we have that same meter there, the 4/4. And again, that top 4 means 4 counts per measure. The bottom 4 means the quarter note receives the count. And again, just bear with us here as we go through these lessons, and they'll make more sense as this gets exposed. Okay, so within a meter of 4, where the top number's 4 counts per measure, and the bottom number, actually more specifically the bottom number, that bottom 4 means the quarter note receives the count. So that's if that's true, if a quarter note receives a count, that means a half note's always going to be 2 counts. A whole note's always going to be 4 counts. In other words, 4 of those quarter notes tied together. The half note would be 2 of those quarter notes tied together. And then when the quarter note receives 1 full count, that means an 8th note is half of one of those counts. And then a 16th note is basically a quarter of a quarter note. In other words, it takes 4 16th notes to equal 1 quarter note. And so this is always the case when that bottom number is 4, period. Always, every single time, no matter what. And then the 8th note triplets, it's basically a quarter note divided in thirds. So it takes 3 of those triplets to equal 1 quarter note, 4 of those 16th notes to equal 1 quarter note, and 2 of those 8th notes to equal 1 quarter note. So then looking at that top number 4 means we're only allowed 4 counts. So that means if we played all 8th notes, 8 8th notes fit within 1 measure of 4 counts, 16 16th notes fit within 1 measure of 4 counts, and 12 triplets fit within 1 measure of 4 counts. And we'll go ahead and play these examples right here. I'll play them back to back, one after the other, just to refresh. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So following along with this next slide, there we have the 4 quarter-inch blocks. Above those are representing the 4 quarter notes. So again, that top 4, meaning no more than 4 counts. And remember that 1 inch of space, no more than 4 slots are allowed. And we can see that at the bottom. See how we have each of those 4 quarter-inch blocks broken in 2. So those would represent 1/8-inch blocks. But you see how they're still within 4 spaces? So again, those 4 slots represents that top 4, meaning no more than 4 counts and no less than 4 counts per measure. In other words, 4 slots within the 1 inch space. And then we see that again with the 16ths. See how there's 4 slivers within each of those 4 spaces? Again, those 4 slots, those 4 spaces means that top 4 of the 4/4, that top 4 meaning no more and no less than 4 counts per measure. And with this analogy, we have no more than 4 and no less than 4 slots within that 1 inch space. It's the same thing. I'm just using that as a way to illustrate it. And the same thing with the triplets. There we have those quarter-inch blocks divided into thirds, but again, each one of them was within 4 slots within that 1 inch space, 4 quarter-inch slots. Meaning, again, no more and no less than 4 counts per measure. And then That bottom 4, again, means the quarter note receives the count. So if a quarter is counted as 1, that means an eighth is counted as half of 1. 16th is counted basically as a fourth of a quarter note. And the triplets are each a third of a quarter note. And again, the more we look at this, the more we play, the more it'll come to understanding. You can't always understand everything at once. It just has to be done repeatedly through experience. Here we have 3/4 meter. So in 3/4, that top 3 means no more and no less than 3 counts per measure. So we have to have exactly 3 counts. That bottom 4, same thing. We're counting the quarter note value as 1 count. And all the other note values will follow that using the quarter note as the standard for 1 count. So we're basically just counting 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 and 3 and over again. So with that in mind, let's look at these examples here. So we're going to have quarters, eighths, sixteenths, and triplets all counted within a meter of 3. And again, those measure lines, those vertical lines that separate each of the 3 beats, basically, if you look at the top there, we have the quarter note example. We have 1, 2, 3. We have 4 measures of that 3/4 example. So each of these are 4 measures long. So we're basically playing and counting at the same time in 3, though. So 3/4 meter, 3 counts per measure. Quarter note gets the count. 1 and 2 and 3 and 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 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet. All right, we're going to learn how to play in a meter of 3/8. First, we're going to look at what it's like to play in a meter of 1/4. In other words, the top 1 means there's no more, no less than 1 count per measure. That means within each of those measure lines is only going to be 1 count. So in this case, we're going to be playing triplet values. And just for some practice on technique, see the pick strokes, the down, up, down on 1 triplet, and then the next measure of 1, you're going to come in on an upstroke, up, down, up on that next 1 triplet. So in playing this example, so we're basically counting 1 triplet, 1 triplet, 1 triplet, 1 triplet. This is going to be, it's kind of weird, but I'm using this to make a point on how to understand the measure of 3/8. 1 triplet, 1 triplet, 1 triplet, 1 triplet. Okay, now looking at the 3/8 explanation, at least the initial one, that top 3 again, it's just like when we had the 3/4 example. The 3 means no more, no less than 3 counts per measure. That means within each of those bar lines, each of those measure lines. Now, this is the part that's different. That bottom 8, that means the 8th note, we're considering that as being the single count instead of the quarter note. So instead of 3/4 where the quarter note receives the count, now we're counting each individual 8th note as 1, or as 1 and, if you wanted to. So the 8th note is considered as 1 single count. So all other note values are played or counted in light of how the 8th note's being counted, which is as 1 count. So this is going to make more sense when I do the example right here. in 3/8 timing, 3/8 meter. 4 measures of 3/8 coming up. It's going to sound identical at least in performance, not in counting, but in the way that I play it, it's going to sound identical to the 4 measures of 1/4 played as triplets. But here we're playing 4 measures of 3/8 in which the 8th note is receiving the count. So we're counting them as the 8th note being each individual count. And it'll make more sense when I do it here. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so the difference between 3/8 and 1/4 is basically the click. We put a click on each count in 3/8. In other words, we put a click on 1, a click on 2, a click on 3. Whereas in 1/4, we just had the click on 1, and we're playing just the triplets with our pick. And in here, we have a click on each count. Even though they both sound identical playing-wise, it's all on the composer and who's writing it that decides whether the music's going to be written in 3/8 or 1/4. It's kind of a toss-up, but the musician has to be able to read and interpret and play it a couple different ways. And that's why we did that. And in following the logic of the 8th note receiving the count, it would then follow, okay, if we're counting a single 8th note as a single count, therefore tying an 8th note into another 8th note, that would actually be 2 counts total. So playing an 8th note and tying it into another 8th note, it's going to be a quarter note, but because we're in the meter of 8, that quarter note's going to be held out for 2 counts just like the half note was in 4. So don't get overloaded with this. Just listen to the examples and try to play and follow along. There's actually a more full explanation as this lesson goes. So we'll go ahead and play it and listen and internalize, and then there'll be further explanation to check out later. Example A. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so let's look at B on the slide here. So those 2 8th notes tied equals a quarter note. And now you see how below it we have the 3 8th notes. The first 2 8th notes are tied with that 3rd 8th note, which is on count 3, left over. So it's going to be written, the quarter note right below that is going to substitute for those first 2 8th notes tied on counts 1 and 2. And then that leftover 8th note with the flag, that's the single 8th note that's left over, that's going to be count 3. So looking at example C, it's going to sound identical to A. It's going to be played identically to A. It's going to be counted identically to A. It just looks different and it's written differently. So instead of 2 8th notes tied, we have that quarter note and then that 3rd 8th note left over with the flag. And remember, we're in the meter of 8, so now quarter notes are counted as 2, just like the half notes were counted as 2 counts when we were in the meter of 4. But now we're in 3/8. 3 beats per measure. 8th note is counted as 1 single count. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. All right. Next example here, we're tying the last 2 8th notes on count 2. So we're picking count 1, we're picking count 2. We're letting count 2 ring into 3, so that's 2 8th notes tied. That's basically the same thing as putting a quarter note on count 2 in the example below, the second example. So again, we're going to play, we're going to count, try to tap your foot, play, count out loud, read the notation. So I'm going to play the first example. So try to play and read so this all makes more sense. Play, read, and count. That helps you internalize this while you're looking at the screen. And then I'll play the second example where the quarter note is being used instead of the 2 8th notes tied. And to reinforce it, we have 3 counts per measure. We're counting in groupings of 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And the 8th note is written and counted as 1 single count. So therefore, 2 8th notes tied will be equivalent to 2 counts, and it's written as a quarter note, because 2 8th notes tied as a quarter note, because we're in the meter of 8, because 8th note gets the count, the quarter note rings out for 2 full counts, as if it was a half note where we're in a meter of 4/4, where the bottom 4 meaning the quarter note gets the count. And again, I have another full explanation after this, so just bear with me. Play, count, read, internalize these examples as we go, and it'll click. It can't all be understood in one shot. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. And now the next example where the quarter note happens on count 2, ringing out into count 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. All right, now, here we are. We have 3/8 notes tied. Remember when we studied the dotted quarter note in the previous lesson on dotted notes? 3/8 notes joined together equals a dotted quarter note every single time. The difference is we're in a meter of 3/8, so that dotted quarter note is going to be counted differently than when we were in 4/4. Okay? So the quarter note, because it's 3/8 notes tied together, and because we're in a meter of 3/8, that dotted quarter note is going to be counted and played. It's going to sustain for 3 full counts, just like a dotted half note when we're in 4/4. So the dotted half note, when we had 4 counts where the quarter note receives the count, the dotted half note rang out for 3 counts. Now the dotted quarter note rings out for 3 counts because we're in a meter of 3/8, and because 3/8 notes tied equals a dotted quarter note. And again, just play, internalize, read, and follow the instructions. Try to pause and read and study these slides as they go too, and just think about it. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. And here we are at that slide which I promised that explained everything. This will probably require some study and contemplation on your part. So definitely pause the slide and look at it, internalize it, but I'll try to go along with it. So looking on the left, we have the meter of 4/4. The top 4 counts per measure. So that means we don't count to 3, we don't count to 5, we count to exactly 4, and then right after 4, count 1 happens again. That's when we're playing in a meter of 4/4. And the bottom 4, that means the quarter note receives the count. So looking at all those note values there, if the quarter note is counted as a single count, therefore an 1/8 note is half of that count. If the quarter note is counted as one single count, then the dotted quarter note is going to be 1.5 counts. Remember when we said a dot placed in front of a note increases that note value by half of itself? So half of a quarter note is an 1/8 note. So therefore, it's a quarter note plus an 1/8. And again, we're counting the quarter note as one single count. And the 1/8 note, therefore, being half a count. So that's 1.5 counts, the dotted quarter note. And looking at the quarter note, again, as a single count, 2 quarter notes tied and joined together equals a half note. So when we're in a meter of 4/4, that bottom 4, when the quarter note receives one full count, a half note is always going to be 2 counts every single time. And therefore, the dotted half note would then be 3 full counts. So remember, the dot increases any note by half of itself. So a half note, half of a half note is a quarter note, right? So a half note plus a quarter note is 3 counts. A half note plus half of itself is a half note tied to a quarter note. We're counting the quarter note as 1, so therefore the dotted half note is going to be 3 counts. And again, you might want to review that dotted lesson on dotted notes, which was 1.2.2, and therefore, and you could also look at that dotted half note as 3 quarter notes tied together. So when we're counting the quarter note as one full count, the dotted half note is the same thing as 3 of those quarter notes tied or joined together, 3 counts. That's what that bottom 4 means. The quarter note's counted as 1, so therefore 3 quarter notes tied together will be 3 counts. And we write that as a dotted half note. Looking at the whole note, 4 counts. So again, when we have that bottom 4, 4/4, that bottom 4, the quarter note receives 1 full count. That whole note would be the same thing as 4 quarter notes tied or joined together. It'd be identical. It'd be the same thing. So a whole note in a meter of 4/4 means that whole note receives 4 full counts. Okay, so here we are with a meter of 6/8. So the top number 6 means we're going to count up to 6. 6 counts per measure. So we're counting in groupings of 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then the more elusive number, that bottom 8, the 8th note, now we're counting an 8th note as an individual single count. So let's run it down the line here. So we have an 8th note, that stem with the flag, that's a single 8th note. We're counting that as a single count. So if that's true, the quarter note, when we're in a measure of 6/8, gets 2 full counts. So think of that as 2 8th notes tied or joined together. So we're counting an 8th note as 1. So 2 8th notes tied together is going to be 2 counts. And then when we, in musical notation, 2 8th notes tied together is a quarter note. So now a dotted quarter note, when we're in a measure of 6/8, in other words, when the 8th note receives the count, remember the dotted quarter note is 3 8th notes tied together from our previous lessons? So we're now counting a dotted quarter note as 3 counts instead of 1.5 counts when we're in a measure of 4/4. And again, a lot of this makes a lot more sense when you're playing and you're doing examples and reading music. So you could even get some sheet music and just pick any string on your guitar. You don't have to play the notes, and just try to get the rhythms right. Look at 6/8 examples, 4/4 examples. Just try to do some work yourself, and don't just rely on this instruction or other instructors for your sole musical experience. It's really required for the student to dig in deep themselves and not just rely on the teachings, but to also learn how to teach themselves. Okay. That said, I'm off the soapbox now. So in a meter of 6/8, the 8th note receives 1 full count. Look at the half note when we're in a meter of 6/8. The half note now, that white circle with the stem, equals 4 counts. Why? Because 4 8th notes tied or joined together is the same thing as a half note. The dotted half note, when we were in 4/4, the dotted half note was 3 counts. In other words, 3 quarter notes joined together, tied. Now in a meter 6/8, a dotted half note is counted for that full measure of 6. In other words, it's played and sustained for 6 full counts, because when we're counting the 8th note as 1 count, 6 of those 8th notes tied together is a dotted half note. And you can even try writing the stuff out yourself and figuring it out. In this next example, it's in 6/8 meters, so we're going to have 6 counts per measure, and the 8th note is going to be counted as the single count. So any quarter note you see will be sustained for 2 full counts. Any 8th note you see will ring out for 1 count, and then something else played after it. And then the dotted quarter note will ring out for a full 3 counts. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Again, this may seem fast-paced, so try to get it at your own pace. Stop the slide and set a metronome at a comfortable tempo for you, to where you have a click on each count. So you're putting a click on 1, a click on 2, a click on 3, a click on 4, a click on 5, and a click on 6 on your metronome. And just stop the slide, look at the screen with the metronome going, and play. So just figure out ways to slow this down and get it. This is a lesson you could always go back to. Don't worry about completely comprehending this in one sitting. I would go ahead and move on to the lesson concerning rest. So that would be lesson 1.2.4. And you'll find as the examples go and the subsequent lessons, a lot of this stuff will start to click. And when you revisit this, it'll make even more sense. So don't beat yourself up if you're not getting this right away. It wouldn't be normal for somebody to get this right away, so don't worry about it. And just keep moving on. I would move on to 1.2.4 on rests.